All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Evan. I'm with Armory. I'm just helping out volunteer in this room today. If you guys have any questions or need anything, please let me know. I'm here to introduce today, though, Cameron and Brandon from Armory, who've been doing some stuff with extensibility and Spinnaker through plugins, and they'd love to share what they've been working on with you. So please give them a hand. Thank you.
Hey everyone, I'm Cameron Motevasselani. It's quite a long last name there. I'm a software engineer over at Armory, as well as one of the co-leads for the platform SIG.
I'm Brandon Powell, a very short name, but people tend to call me Brendan, not Brandon, but that's okay. I'll answer to pretty much anything except late for dinner. No laughs. Come on. We like to have a little bit of fun. I'm also a software engineer at Armory, and I co-lead the security SIG.
Cool. So today we're going to be talking about plugins. Not plugins per se, but plugin framework. We want everyone to be able to use plugins and create plugins for their Spinnaker installation. So let's start off with talking about what are plugins in the first place, right? So plugins are used to extend functionality for an existing project. In this case, we're talking about Spinnaker. So Spinnaker has a lot of functionality right out of the box, but it doesn't always match exactly what organizations need. So plugins are a great way of fitting that extra like 5-10%. Again, plugins add additional functionality that doesn't already exist. Can also augment functionality that's currently in the project. You can utilize lifecycle hooks as well in order to hook in with pipelines before and after stage runs, et cetera, et cetera. So who creates plugins? So SaaS service providers would create plugins. So an APM provider, New Relic, it would be great if they had a plugin that you could have a stage call out to plugins to New Relic and get some response from them. Software-defined networking companies, if you want to manage and augment your infrastructure, you could call out to their services, and then you can utilize their services directly from Spinnaker. Also cloud providers, so that would be a great thing to have in cloud drivers, the ability to split up which cloud providers are actually on your cloud driver instance. If you deploy to AWS, for instance, you don't need Azure cloud around. You don't need Oracle cloud. You only really need AWS. Spinnaker administrators and operators would also be key contributors to creating plugins. Why is that? A lot of companies have custom infrastructure and tooling that they need Spinnaker to hook in with. So in order to do that, they need to create a plugin to do that work. They want to be able to share it around across the company, and plugins are a great way to do that. They want to be able to provide a golden path to production. And you can use run job stages today to basically do anything. But if you have a plugin that provides a custom stage, you can then share that around. And that's one of the beautiful things about Spinnaker is it codifies best practices into stages. And anyone who wants to extend Spinnaker today can hop in and extend it. You don't have to learn all the Spinnaker internals, but it definitely helps today. So what's the motivation here for plugins? We talked about some, but we want to lower the barrier of entry to extend Spinnaker functionality. How many people here extend Spinnaker today? It's a good amount of people.
Who wants to extend it?
Yeah, that's about everyone here. Awesome, perfect. So it's actually not that easy to extend Spinnaker. You have to really know the code. You have to know how the different services interact, where the right place to put your code. You need to know best practices along the lines of developing Spinnaker. And this is particularly difficult as a new developer. You're coming into this project. There's 9 services or so, and where do I start, right? Additionally, if you wanted to extend Spinnaker, you need to maintain and keep up your extensions, right? So it makes upgrading harder, which then usually doesn't happen and causes brain drain. How many people, well, I guess we already asked this question of who wants to extend Spinnaker today, but we want to have a lean core and expansive ecosystem for Spinnaker. What does that mean? We want to be able to customize Spinnaker for your org and your use case, or give you the ability to do so. We talk about this a lot as saying we want to meet you where you're at. Additionally, this actually enables us to have smaller binaries, which reduces the threat surface and reduces the core code complexity. We want to also make a simple and stable interfaces so that plugin creators can work against one interface and then have confidence that it works properly. So this is lowering the barrier of entry. So there's other projects that have plugins. We're not the first. Don't want to say that we're taking a lot of input from these, but you can see how plugins they enable projects to be successful. So all of these projects here, Jenkins, Eclipse, WordPress, they're all popular projects that are made more popular because of the plugins. You want to integrate with a service? Well, there's a plugin for that. Jenkins has tons of plugins that integrate with all different kinds of services so that it matches the needs of your organization. If you want to improve ease of use or developer experience and add greater adoption, well, Eclipse has a bunch of plugins that, hey, if you have a plugin that Eclipse can work with, you just make it easier and lower the barrier of entry for developers to use your tools. And then it also enables users to really easily change how the project works. All three of these projects encompass that, but WordPress in particular makes it really easy for non-developers to customize their WordPress installations.
All right, so now we're going to kind of go into a little bit of a mini demo here, showing what is actually available in open source right now. Who's interested in seeing this? Okay. Let's see. It's like a little bit more hands, a little bit more enthusiasm. It's only 2:30 in the afternoon. We're still a little bit awake. We haven't started drinking yet, or at least I haven't. Anybody else? All right, let's go over here, and hopefully this. Let's see if I can make this bigger. Okay. Well, this kind of is not the best, but hopefully, I doubt anybody in the back can actually read this. So what we're actually doing is we're going to actually enable plugins in Halyard, and that's what this how plugins enable does. We're going to enable downloading of those plugins, and Cameron can talk a little bit about that later.
You can probably increase the text size on that.
It's a video.
Okay.
Yeah. Doing live demos are always fun, but who has done a live demo that actually has gone successful every single time? I know I have never. Okay, Rob, I saw that hand. So we decided to record it and play it back for you. But you can actually do this yourself, and the slides are I think they're already available for people to. They will be available. I think at the end of the talk, something like that. And you can actually go ahead and watch the video and follow along on your computer. So essentially, what we've done is we are adding a plugin to Halyard. It is a stage, and this stage plugin that we created. There's actually a link in the slide deck that we'll show you. It's called Random Wait Stage. It essentially you put in the max number of seconds you want the stage to wait, and it'll choose a random number between 0 and that number you put in the UI, and wait that many number of seconds. Very, very, very basic stage, but it shows the power of what's available. Now you could go ahead and make a stage that does something a lot more complex. For example, copying a resource in an S3 bucket from one location to another. Very, very simple. You pull in the S3 Java API, and you're off to the races. But as you can see, here we actually are looking at the logs of Orca, and we can actually show that the plugin is actually loaded. And then we can actually go in here, and this says max time to wait. That says 8 seconds. And we can actually run the stage, and it'll wait a random number of seconds between 0 and 8. And then we can actually go ahead and view the source tab, which we can click on right now. And you can see the time to wait was actually 5 seconds. The max wait time was 8 seconds. All this gets added into the context of the stage. So it's pretty awesome. And we're running it again to show that it hopefully chose a different time than 5 seconds. I think this time it did 6, is that? Yep, 6 seconds. So as you can see, this is just a random, very simple plugin that Cameron and I created. And it works pretty well. And again, you can do way more complex things than what we did, but to show how it works, we have a very simple repo. If you go to github.com/armory/stage-plugin, you can go ahead and check it out. All right, we go back over to the slides. All right.
Cool. So before plugins were added to Spinnaker, stage creation was kind of hard. What does this look like? This is a lot of code in order to create a stage. And it spans multiple services as well. So if you want to add a stage, you need to watch out for gotchas. You need to go into Orca. You need to create a stage definition builder, a stage context. You need to add tasks. You need to go into deck. You need to create a stage. You need to ensure the stage is registered with the pipeline. And you need to make sure all the execution details are set up correctly. So modifying Spinnaker was and is hard. We're working to change that. You want to add a new Cloud Driver endpoint. How do you do this? Well, in order to do this, you need to have deep knowledge of how Cloud Driver works, how the different services interact. If you want to extend or contribute back to OSS, that's another consideration as well. For instance, if you wanted to make a Cloud Driver for Raspberry Pi, well, you can do that as you extend Spinnaker on your Spinnaker extension, which would be like another project building on top of Cloud Driver. Or you can contribute this back to open source, which is great. It spreads that contribution around so everyone can use it. But depending on your timeline, you might have different concerns. It might need it today. Let's say you have your own custom reporting tool. Well, how are you going to integrate it? You need to know how multiple services work and interact. Do you hook into Echo? Do you make a webhook stage? Options are really good, but too many options make it hard to define best practices. So in order to make good decisions, it requires a lot of knowledge on how Spinnaker works and interacts. Do you want to fork or extend Spinnaker? Both are a lot of work. Both require maintenance as well, right? So you have to have build, test, release on top of development of the code.
You also have to pay attention to what's going on upstream.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And then you can get left behind, and now you're stuck in the past, and you're not getting new updates.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about after plugins. So we want stage creation to be easy. We're focusing on that right now because it's one of the most high leverage things that we can do from the community standpoint. And y'all saw the code beforehand, right? There's a whole bunch of pieces of code on that slide. It's going to be much simpler now. We created an interface for plugin developers to use to create a stage. Essentially, you just implement the simple stage interface, and you're off to the races. Granted, some of the stuff will change, but we do want to offer simple APIs for for plugin creators to use to make their jobs easier. We don't want you to have to go through the entire process of what you have to do now of getting something into open source if you don't want to maintain it yourself. As Cameron said, timelines may not always line up. If you need it today, this may not be possible. unless you give Rob a few $100s. Is that right, Rob?
I don't decide games. Sorry.
So how do I actually do this? We do have documentation up on Spinnaker.io. I really recommend you guys go to this link. Even right now, I see a bunch of people with laptops out. Definitely suggest going there. Take a look. If you notice any problems with it, please let us know. Create an issue, and we will address it. We do have the documentation SIG as well, and they are more than happy. Where's Brian at? Is Brian in here? No, I don't see him. Well, I'm going to offer up Brian, our documentation writer, and he can definitely go ahead and fix it for us. And as the example that I showed earlier in the demo video, github.com/armory/stage-plugin, this has the backend code that's in Orca, and it does have some front-end code that works in the Armory version of Spinnaker right now. There is, actually, I'm going to talk about that later because we have a section on RFCs. Everybody love RFCs? Okay, I'm getting a little bit of feedback. I'd like a little more. All right. So, back over to Cameron.
Yeah, so the initial implementation for plugins is going to be described right now. So what we started out with is this MVP. That's what we do at Armory, is we like to do experimentation and getting things into customers' and users' hands as soon as possible. So we want to get feedback really quickly, right? We want to understand if this is something the community actually wants. So part of that is trying to get feedback and figure out use cases that the community needs in order to determine how and what to build next.
Do you want to mention the email address that we have?
Yeah, that's right. So we have plugins@armory.io. Please send us an email with any plugin recommendations you have or extension considerations. There's also a plugins channel on OSS Slack. Highly recommend you join it.
If you want to write a plugin, we definitely want to talk to you. Anybody
Yes.
want to write a plugin this weekend?
So
This is a tough crowd.
So as Brandon mentioned earlier, there's definitely a lot of changes going on right now. And in fact, we already know what the next steps for plugins are going to be. Netflix is leading the charge in developing the PF4J framework and bringing it in-house. There's many benefits with using an existing framework. It's battle tested, it already exists, it has a whole community around it who are active. So, community involvement. Like Brandon said, RFCs are a big part of working with the community. So Andrew Backus from Armory created an RFC way earlier this year, back in March, to kick off this idea of plugins in Spinnaker. So Netflix and Google are working with Armory as well in order to iterate on all these RFCs that we have in order to create the right plugin solution. If you want to join, again, there's a plugin channel on Slack. There's also a new SIG, the platform SIG, that is basically taking ownership of this. We meet every other Thursday, and the next meeting is going to be 11/21 at 11 a.m. Pacific time.
How many people are going to join that SIG?
Yeah.
Just like 2? Come on, we want more feedback.
Want a little excitement here. So what's in Spinnaker today? We're talking about extending Spinnaker and the plugin framework. So what are we exactly talking about? So in Spinnaker 1.16 or later, we have the ability to add custom stages. So you can do that right now. There is no UI component to stages at the moment, as that's something that the community is still working on and iterating on. There's an active RFC or design doc for it, and please join in, give us some feedback so we develop the right thing. This also requires Halyard version 1.23 or later. That is, if you use Halyard to deploy your code. So why do these versions actually matter? So the Spinnaker version, services need to have the lifecycle hooks added. What essentially is going on is Orca will scan the directory and add jars to a class path, and that are then scanned when Spinnaker application context starts up. So the services download jars. That's why the Spinnaker version matters. The Halyard version comes into play when we want to modify the configs in a safe way. So Halyard manages the create, update, delete for the plugin configurations. As we've been talking or alluding to, I guess, the first iteration has been on custom stages. So how does it work? Again, a plugin needs to create a simple stage. It needs to implement the simple stage interface. So if you use, let's see, you need to define the input, output, and context for the stage so that you can hook in with the rest of Spinnaker.
How many people in here actually have added a stage into Spinnaker, besides the Netflix team?
You mean like beyond custom run jobs?
Yeah. Doesn't look like anybody. So when Cameron said input, output, and context,
Context, yeah.
do people know what that means? This is why we need plugins.
Yes, yes. So let's see. So Halyard ensures that the plugin config files are present on the Spinnaker services, and that all happens prior to the service starting up. Because we do that, we can actually hook in before the Spring context initialization so that it can have the beans available to overload and extend functionality. So in this case, the jar should implement simple stage. The simple stages are turned into simple stage definition builders, which inherit from stage definition builder and get hooked all into the stage list. Again, there's no UI currently as we're figuring that out, but you're still able to utilize these stages by editing the stage as JSON. So there are some drawbacks to the existing plugin solution. So if you want to add, create, update, or remove a plugin, you have to redeploy some of the Spinnaker services. That's not always a fun thing to do. Right now, only one interface has been simplified. And again, this comes back to, well, we need more feedback from the community in order to figure out more places to simplify. Right now, with the implementation, as some of you might have guessed, plugins can actually add a lot more than just stages, but you need to be very, very careful in doing that. You can break your your Spinnaker setup. Right now, as well, plugins there's no dependency isolation, so your dependencies must fit in with other plugins that are present, as well as the Spinnaker services. And like we say, I've been saying, there's no UI. Again, it's not a blocker. You can still utilize this. Cool. So talking about advanced features, the unsafe portion I mentioned earlier, you can actually just overload anything in Orca right now and modify any bean there. Don't do this unless you really know what you're doing. It doesn't go to the simpleness, but that's why we're trying to move to a new framework where it has well-defined extension points and better life cycle. So if you extend Spinnaker service as well right now, you can have plugins and more Spinnaker services. So essentially, you would have main inherit or extend Spinnaker application instead of Spring Boot Servlet Initializer. And then you have to make sure your component scanning is set up to scan COM, Netflix, Spinnaker plugin. You can see how this works in Orca, for an example. All right, next steps. All right, so you get an RFC. You get an RFC. And, yeah, there's no RFCs under your seats, but there's one right over there. So PF4J was validated and implemented by in Spinnaker by Rob, who's sitting right over there from Netflix. What does PF4J get us, though? Right. So PF4J helps a lot with class loader isolation. What does that mean? Plugins can now have their own dependencies and not have to worry about trampling other plugins. They do still have to share dependencies with the Spinnaker service in question, but there's also ways to get around that, which we'll talk about in a sec. So what PF4J does is it requires well-defined extension points. This helps lower the barrier of entry. You cannot mess up because if you don't define, if you don't do it correctly, what am I trying to say here? You need to just implement the interface, and you don't have to worry about accidentally trampling other pieces of code. Again, extension points are well-defined interfaces, and the part of the point here is to lower the barrier of entry. So the intent is to define an extension point that's a simple interface for plugin developers to use, while allowing core Spinnaker developers to update functionality without breaking plugin interfaces. You can still extend Spinnaker like the MVP implementation, but via PF4J. This is considered unsafe. PF4J also allows the ability to source plugins from not just your local system, but it allows for remote plugins. What does this mean? You can now have a plugin written in any language. The plugin will essentially be a service that your service, the Spinnaker service, would talk to.
All right. So as Cameron mentioned, currently there's no, in open source, there's no front end. There's an RFC though. How many people can I get in this room by end of the weekend to go to this link, go to the Google Doc, and start talking and adding their thoughts and suggestions to a UI RFC for plugins? I get some hand raised. Okay, we got a few people. Thanks, Rob. Chris, nothing?
Well, I already did that.
Yes, and thank you for helping out. We greatly appreciate it. We need more feedback from everybody. We wanna make this right. We wanna do this in the best way possible. Obviously, without slowing us down, but we do want to get people's thoughts and opinions. And this Google Doc will be translated over into the community repo on GitHub as an actual RFC once we get a little bit more feedback. So essentially, what things do we want people to be able to do from a UI perspective? Some things I can think of that I know the last company I worked at would care about would be extending the header of Spinnaker to include my company's logo. I think that'd be pretty cool. That way it's branded for your company. Being able to possibly override all the CSS and make it your company's colors. That'd be pretty cool. It's a very normal thing to see. Are those things that the community wants? If so, let's talk about it. If not, we don't have to worry about that functionality. So essentially, what do you want to see? Anybody have any thoughts right now what they want to see? Yeah, go ahead.
Are there authorization hooks?
From the front end
The
perspective?
front end, right? Like, is there a permissioning system in the plugin system?
As go ahead, Rob. You're gonna say something?
Nope.
All right.
That is the answer. Yes.
As of right now, no. But this is why we want to talk with the community and see what people actually want. And if there's a lot of interest in something like that, let's figure that out. Let's talk about it. Let's see if we can add that in. Do you have any thoughts, Rob?
Nope. Not yet.
Cool. So what we talked about a little bit earlier, we mentioned remote plugins. And remote plugins, the way that they would be implemented in this PF4J framework would be two parts. One would be a service that you write in whatever stack you want. It's running as a service. You can have it running as a container, as an image, whatever. And then you also need to extend the Spinnaker service that needs to talk to your plugin, remote plugin. So it's like a two-part thing. Again, it can be written in whatever language you want. whatever dependencies you need. This really enables non-Java devs to contribute and extend Spinnaker. The language doesn't have to be Java. I know in DevOps there's a lot of Go usage, so that would be a great language to use. But whatever floats your boat. Again, lots of DevOps tooling uses Docker containers, so that's, you can deploy a Docker container that is your service, and that would be essentially the remote piece of this. So, PF4J. We talked a little bit about this earlier, but it's an existing open source framework. You don't have to maintain a custom one, which is great. So it's open source. There's an active chat, and there's community members that are pretty responsive in there. We're already giving back to improving PF4J. One of our teammates, Clay McCoy, is an Army engineer. He's contributed back to PF4J in terms of Gradle updates, Gradle support for the project. As we mentioned before as well, it helps with class loader isolation, so plugins can have their own dependencies. Again, PF4J is battle tested. It's used by multiple other projects, so we know it works. And then again, it has well-defined extension points, which are key to lowering the barrier of entry for plugin creators. So what are some use cases that we've kind of thought of? I kind of mentioned earlier, it would be great to have a cloud driver with only the code necessary. Pre and post stage task pipeline event hooks would be great. You could have FedRAMP compliance or something like that, where before you deploy a service, you need to ensure that all the proper checks are in place. And then pipeline validation on save. So there's an interface that exists for doing this, but nothing implements it. But this would help ensure a safe delivery of your applications. Again, none of this is promised or done, but that's why we need your help to figure out what your guys' use cases and needs are in order to support those. And finally, does anyone have questions?
Yeah, there is a mic.
Fair.
No, it's just recording. Would you mind speaking up while I...
Yeah, you gave Jenkins as an example. Like most of people tried and use Jenkins, and plugins are great, but Jenkins, like, it's kind of a bit out of control. Like, yeah, they produce security issues, they cause dependency problems. So there seems to be no oversight to the plugin ecosystem, and it's also some very basic stuff. You have to install a plugin for that, for example, Git. Like, how do you plan to, do you have any plans to have some kind of oversight to plugin ecosystem and where to draw the line, okay, this should be core feature, and this type of stuff could be plugins, so Spinnaker doesn't end up in a situation like Jenkins has today, 1,500 plugins is like, no.
I can answer.
For users, I'm a user.
I can answer the first part of that as to we know how Jenkins works now. We know that it's not pretty. We can learn from that. Let's try not to repeat that mistake. Yes, we're going to make mistakes. That's life, right? But let's try to learn from Jenkins, WordPress, Eclipse. Name any other major open source project that has plugins. Let's see if we can learn from that.
Yeah. We would like to also have a technology compatibility kit, so that as you produce plugins, you have a way of validating it and ensuring it would work with a certain version of Spinnaker.
And to go with that, personally, I would like to see a marketplace where we can say this version of this plugin works with these versions of Spinnaker. Maybe a rating system, maybe a comment system, something along those lines, so that we can actually track these sorts of things. And maybe we have integration tests with this that, maybe somebody like Armory, maybe we're the ones that does that, or maybe Netflix does it, maybe Google does it, maybe somebody else does it.
Community owned.
Yeah.
I was going to say, is that probably what delineates between open source and the commercial versions of these things is a curated and certified set of plugins, as opposed to the Wild West?
So like it could. There's have not been decisions made in that regard. We have both used Jenkins in the past and have done plugins and upgrades and restarts, and we feel your pain. we do not want to cause that sort of pain for others. Yes.
All right, this person with the Sonotype shirt on that had his question first.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in experimenting. Do you have any recommendations on how I might test? Like if I build a plugin and I've got, I think the code in place, is there kind of any integration test helping, or do I have to deploy the plugin to a live Spinnaker environment?
Yeah, you would have to deploy it to a live Spinnaker environment currently.
And you said at current, it's you have to. There's a designated folder that you drop the jar in.
Do
you
you?
have to restart the service? Is that correct?
Well, no. So depending on how do you deploy? Do you use Halyard to deploy your Spinnaker services, or?
I'm new to Spinnaker, so
I
this
see.
will be my first time.
Yeah. So depending on how you want to deploy your services, you essentially need to have files in place on before the service starts up. So there's a plugins YAML that is separate from the services configuration, and it's needed to be a separate file as the service configuration is not read in yet. So again, we're hooking in before Spring context initialization happens, so that we can load the plugins. Yes.
Would the intention to be to replace the current stages with all plugins?
No, not at all. Some stages I think should be replaced. I think Gremlin's super cool. I don't necessarily think it should be in core Spinnaker. But I think that's up for the community to decide. There was the question earlier about how do we determine whether something's core Spinnaker or an extension, a plugin. That has not been decided yet. I believe it was called out as a non-issue, or in the RFC, I believe we called it out as like a non-topic at the moment.
Wouldn't there be fundamentally two interfaces, right? There basically the core stage interface and plugin?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the plugin interface should be simple and stable. That helps lower their barrier of entry, as well as enables Spinnaker core developers to continue iterating on how stages work, or how whatever the backing
So would there be
interface.
why would I choose a plugin over a core interface then?
Some of it could be due to time. For example, if you need your stage in right now to do your deployment to production, well, unless you pay Rob a few $1,000s now, maybe, you're probably not going to get that. You're not going to get it in ASAP. Doing it as a plugin, you could have it deployed to your Spinnaker today without having to go through the process of working with the community, which I think you should work with the community, but you don't have to go through that process as a pain point right now. Because let's say it's you need to do this for your deployment before Christmas. Well, people are on vacations. People are not really going to be in the community-wise as active. So as a plugin, you have it today. That's one answer to that. Another could be something to the effect of, depends on how complex your stage has to be. If you're building something that talks to all the different microservices and doing a very massive thing, well, that may be better fitted as a core component, where you have a little bit more access, more higher grained access. But if it's something very simple, or I should say more simple, like maybe copying from S3, one location in S3 to another, or maybe deploying to a Raspberry Pi, something like that, where it's not all that complicated, a plugin might work for that. So as Cameron said, as of right now, we don't have a true definition, but I assume that's something we're going to be talking about soon.
Yeah, by having a plugin as well, you don't have to rebuild Spinnaker or extend it. You just make a plugin and ensure it's present on the service upon startup. And as well, as we said earlier, it's a lot of this is to lower the barrier of entry so that more people can contribute and extend meeting them where their organizations are.
What's your current thoughts for authenticating? Like you talked about remote plugins. That's typically something that gets me interested because that's how you have like those kind of like long-lived static credentials that tend to sneak in those discussions. What's your thoughts for avoiding them?
I think PF4J would be able to help a little bit with that. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I believe that would be something that PF4J would be handling for us. I think.
Okay.
Rob, does that sound about right?
Remote plugins are going to be built as a form. The transport for interacting with remote plugins is going to be written as a plugin itself. PF4J is explicitly designed for doing class loader isolation of certain user-land code from core code. So it doesn't really have any constructs around like a remote concept, so that's never going to be building in. The reason why we are kind of talking about remote plugins as part of PF4J is that PF4J has some common elements that you'd be able to reason about a local plugin and a remote plugin, kind of the same taxonomies. But PF4J isn't really going to be buying us a whole lot, except for just like the installation and operations aspect of connecting it to the remote service. Does that make sense?
That there's room for still being concerned, but yes, it makes sense.
Yeah, there's a lot of concern in plugins. It's very complex problems.
And I would very appreciate those concerns added to the RFCs and docs.
It's already open on there.
Perfect.
Do you have opinions? Never. Never. Can I have follow-up questions?
Yeah.
Any thoughts on access control to limit what the plugin can touch?
That's where PF4J extension points come in as well. Is
Okay.
that PF4J helps with loading what the extension points are.
Okay, cool.
So currently, in the current model, as Cameron said earlier, you can do anything.
Okay.
If you want to destroy the world, you can.
Okay.
We don't recommend it, obviously. I mean, you're a security guy, so have fun with it. But PF4J would be the solution for that.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Anybody want to write a plugin this weekend?
Good point.
So thank you very much, everybody.